I was saying that it's really exciting to have this conversation now, especially since we just heard Eva talking about the 2019 GSDR, and the 2023 GSDR is just now going through editing the draft report. So it's a really interesting time to be, let's say, coming into the details of how to put these recommendations and these points that were made in the last report into practice. And one thing that is, let's say, very important in terms of this is how our governments, how our partners, how we ourselves are thinking about SDG progress, and how we want to report on it, and how we want to say how well we're doing or how badly we're doing in terms of SDG progress. So this is what I'll try to touch with this presentation, how we're dealing with these, or how we could think about implementing the transformation areas of the last GSDR report in the follow-up and review of SDG implementation. So one thing that, let's see, if I can move to the next slide. One thing that I wanted to highlight, and this is something that Dirk Messner used to say a lot, one of the experts working in the 2019 report, was that it was really important for the GSDR not to focus on the boxes, or let's say the SDGs and the themes, but really in the arrows and how they connect. And this is really crucial because when we are thinking about follow-up and review and how we're looking back at how well we're doing and how much progress we're making, there are very few examples actually of governments that are really taking on this question to systematically analyze how the implementation of the SDGs is looking in terms of the interlinkages, how some of the topics that are making good progress are impacting others and perhaps not so positive ways. And it's a really tricky exercise to do, but there's very few examples of countries trying to do that. One that I can mention is in 2021, Sweden wanted to take on a challenge like this. So as SEA, as Stockholm Environment Institute, we supported them in their 2021 VNR to try to look at their progress on SDGs from this systematic perspective, and trying to portray that as one of the lenses that you could apply in terms of follow-up and review. The next point that I wanted to mention was that the last report, right, it does have these 6 entry points that were being mentioned earlier also by Eva, but it was always so important that they said you always have to take one of these entry points, connect them to one of the levers. That was one of the other concepts that they introduced, right, on finances, governance, economy. And once you connect one of those two, you have a pathway, and you can think about a way to move forward and how to create transformation. So this is important because if we said we took the financing of food and nutrition in Finland, that is a pathway according to the last GSDR report, but it would look very differently in Finland than it would in Colombia, than it would in Jamaica. So it's very context dependent, and this is something that also impacts how we do follow-up and review, and how we have to look at, let's say, each country against itself, or each place or each context against itself, because it's really very different how these topics and these concepts come together. And the last one is because we hear a lot in follow-up and review that data is not enough, that information is not available. And this is really tricky because blind spots in information are really leading us to trade-offs in terms of implementing the SDGs in many contexts and in many examples. One that I can think of to mention was, of course, the food and cities, and how we saw that during the pandemic, how all of these trade-offs started to arise when a crisis like that came up. Or mobility and gender is one that comes up quite a bit, where we don't really think about gender-specific issues when we're developing mobility systems in different cities. So I wanted to mention those, let's say, big questions about the challenges that come with trying to implement these transformation areas or entry points in the follow-up and review. This is just one example that we did, and it's a bit more global. So the office of the executive office of the Secretary General of the UN asked us at SEI to do a baseline on how the SDGs were being implemented, especially at the regional and local level. So now that we are, of course, national levels have been so important in bringing about the commitments to the SDGs, but now that we're moving a little bit beyond that, and we're trying to figure out how our local governments doing, the ones that are on the ground, the ones that have to make the decisions and really show up for the SDGs and put them into practice, how is it going for them? So this is one thing that we did. We wanted to have a global look at how SDGs were making progress at the local level, and also develop a strategy. And this 10-year strategy is to inform the work of the 2030 Coalition. These very, very wide group of local governments worldwide, and also partners of local governments that are trying to move the SDGs forward. So just to mention, we did interviews, we did workshops, we did case studies around the world, but I wanted to mention here that it's quite a process, just even trying to come up with a global view of how SDGs are making progress, because of what I was saying earlier, it's all very context dependent. We did look at the topics that are here to the right: policy coherence, how does that relate from the national level to the local, the multi-level governance and partnerships. Are they looking at these from an integrated perspective, as I mentioned before? SDG synergies and interlinkages, what are the trade-offs? And financing, of course, comes up as a very big issue. So these relate quite a bit to the GSDR transformation points, and this is why I wanted to talk about this example. Some of the results, and these are very broad, very difficult to generalize, but of course we know that now a challenge to translate all of these transformation concepts to the ground are delayed by everything that had to do with the pandemic and all that implied in terms of progress, because virtually all of the countries or all of the local governments that we spoke to reported back that they had been seriously pushed back in terms of progress when this happened, and they are still even trying to begin to understand what the effect was of the pandemic on SDG progress, and how that has put us in a detrimental position, let's say, to achieve the 2030 agenda. Another one is that a bit more positive, policy coherence has been taken up as a good, let's say, discourse and dialogue. Institutions have also changed, either by adapting old ones or having new ones. Of course, one thing that is important also for the follow-up and review is that the more concentrated the power is in countries, the more difficult it is to, let's say, move faster or have more progress on these goals. And nobody has achieved the SDGs, as far as I know, to this day. And this is also the case at the local level, that there's still open questions for everybody to deal with. And the case of data, as I was saying, that is creating these blind spots and that is sort of sneaking up behind us, that we don't know that we're having effects that are perhaps negative on some aspects that we thought we were improving by the efforts being made on SDGs. This is just to show, this is the example for the Latin American cases, but true for all the regions that we looked at, is that the regions that had more stakeholder engagement or more varied groups of actors being involved in SDG implementation have reported much better results in terms of how much progress they have made, which is, let's say, to be expected, but of course also more difficult to manage in the specific cases. And a second one that I wanted to mention is that there's a big mix in terms of the topics that are making good progress on the SDGs. So we can't really say the environmental SDGs we know that are, let's say, doing not as well as the others, but there is quite a mix of the ones that are being reported as really moving forward at once we get to that local level, to that concrete level, which is also interesting to look at, because it could come from all kinds of reasons that could do with priority setting and with how countries are choosing which SDGs to move forward. The question here, and why I wanted to show this, is that it's not necessarily systematic in terms of, okay, we know that from the constellation of topics that we have and issues that we have, if we move these SDGs forward, we know that this is where we will have the most positive effect in the whole system. It's not that usually, so that's a big concern in terms of moving forward with the agenda. And this last example that I wanted to mention, and I'm not bringing it up just to show a picture of me and Hannah hanging out in New York, not at all. It's rather to say that we were here at the HLPF looking at local examples of reporting on the SDGs from the city of Bonn in Germany and the city of Pereira in Colombia. And Pereira was the first city to put out a local voluntary review. And one thing that we did learn in this sense was, again, that COVID was still having a lot to do with how much progress the local level is making, but also that it's quite a challenge to even think in terms of SDG reporting for many local governments. And there's a lot of need of support and accompaniment and just guiding everybody through the process of putting out such a report, but it's quite a useful exercise just because it gets everybody more in the SDG mindset. It gets governments really interested in participating also in these global discussions, and it also helps us connect the most local level of implementation to the global processes that have to do with the 2030 agenda. So this is one thing that we can really do to support our governments if we want to get into the numbers and get into the processes to really support in terms of developing these type of reports. And wanted to close just with these thoughts for our conversations and discussions. And one is that the work that I just mentioned is just really an illustrative example of how the entry points of the GSDR, how the levers can be put into practice when it comes to follow up and review, right? I was focusing more on these side, let's say, of the SDGs, but there's a lot that we need to understand still in terms of really what integrated approaches mean for SDG implementation and reporting, and having more of the systems thinking approach and thinking about the arrows and not the boxes, as I said at the beginning. A poor performance, as we're seeing by now in terms of we're at the middle of the time of the SDGs and it's not looking very positive, these can create a very, let's say, a sense of urgency or a go big or go home type of approach that could be good or could be not as positive, because it could lead us to cherry picking, to, let's say, hasting through the process that we were supposed to have, let's say, enough time for. And how we do this prioritization is important, because if it's not done in a way that is really evidence-based, then these priority setting can probably lead us into even more trade-offs as we move towards the second half of SDG implementation. So these are my thoughts, and I want to thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to the further discussions that we'll have. So thank you, Carlos.